So it is currently July of 2023, and Metroid Prime 4 is still a mystery. We've been waiting 6 years for information on that game, screenshots, gameplay, confirmations of a release date, literally anything about it, and sadly, we've gotten nothing other than the announcement of a reboot in 2019. Of course, for me, on this channel, where my channel is at least 50% focused on the Metroid franchise, I've covered this extensively. I constantly find reasons to talk about not only Metroid as a franchise, but specifically Metroid Prime 4. However, today, the Metroid topic we're going to discuss doesn't have to do with that mysterious title. I actually want to talk about them revisiting an idea that they've tried in the past, which is third-person 3D Metroid gameplay. Naturally, the Metroid franchise has been in third-person many times. In fact, more than half of the games ever released in the franchise have been in the third person, which of course is the 2D games. A 2D Metroid game is effectively a third-person game, we all know that. But outside of those 2D third-person games, we primarily have seen Metroid in first person, right? Because the Metroid Prime franchise, which includes the 3 main games, Metroid Primes 1, 2, and 3, we can assume Metroid Prime 4 will also be, of course, first person. And then even the 3DS games like Metroid Prime Hunters and Metroid Prime Federation Force, all first person games. Metroid Prime Pinball, that's a little bit different scenario. We're not going to talk about that one. But in general, on the whole, we've seen Metroid in 2 basic perspectives. 2D, which is third person, and first person. However, they did of course try one other time a very unique approach to Metroid gameplay, where it was in third person, but it wasn't 2D. It was a 3D third person perspective, and it is everyone's favorite Metroid game. This bad boy right here, Metroid Other M. Yes, we all know Metroid Other M is an insanely controversial and divisive game, which has always made me sad, and I'll get into that in a little bit. I've obviously discussed many times in the past my feelings on this game, and it has to come up in this conversation, of course. But the video and the topic isn't really about Metroid Other M specifically. It's more about the idea that the game tried. And again, it's the introduction of third-person 3D gameplay, which is something very unique to this game. It is the one and only time Nintendo has ever tried to take this franchise and Samus as a character into that perspective. And I think it's really cool of the many footnotes Metroid Other M actually holds and introduced to us. I think it's that. It's a unique take on the universe of Metroid, and something that, even though it obviously did not work for a huge amount of people, you could probably even say for most people, it's pretty cool that they tried this with this title, and it's made me wonder for years if Nintendo ever would revisit the concept of this kind of gameplay again. So naturally, I need to discuss my thoughts very briefly on this game, on Metroid Other M. It's a title that pretty much since the inception of my YouTube channel almost 10 years ago, I've gone on record saying that I'm a fan of Metroid Other M. I like the things it does well much more than I dislike the things that it doesn't do well. It's a game that I've always acknowledged some of the flaws and some of the things that don't actually work within this title. But I think that the unique thing about Metroid Other M, and even my personal thoughts and feelings on it as a huge Metroid fan, you guys know this, again, my YouTube channel is probably more than 50% focused just on the Metroid franchise because I love it that much, and I am one of those diehard Metroid fans that does like and defend this game. But I think that the unique situation around the game and my personal feelings on it is really kind of born out of the fact that the negative conversation has been so toxic, and people who dislike the game are so passionately against it and have such, I don't want to say toxic because that's not really the right word. I mean, I think my brain almost defaults to that word, but it's not actually accurate. It's just how people vehemently say that it's like the worst thing ever, and it's an abomination to God, and it's an abomination to the franchise or to Samus the character, and all of these things. And anyone has the right to like or dislike a game. People can dislike this game. People can hate this game. That's fine. But I think that what I've seen happen over the course of maybe the past 10 years is as people talk so passionately about hating the game, I'm someone who's always felt the game is just pretty good with a lot of flaws. And I think that to kind of sum up my feelings around this game and why I defend it the way I do, it comes down to the fact that in a different timeline where people were just maybe ambivalent to how they felt about it, like, yeah, I liked it, or nah, I didn't really like that game, but whatever, I probably would have much more muted conversations about the fact that I think it's a pretty good game. But it's one of those things where I think we as fans can accidentally course correct too heavily. And so when I see the conversation so, like, disturbingly toxic, I said I wouldn't use that word, but you know what I mean, so disturbingly negative against this game, I almost come out stronger in my defense of the game. I'm not lying about it. I like this game. There are great things that it does. I do like the story. There are things I think are really bad in this game. Most notably, Samus waiting for authorization to use her weapons and her upgrades. That is, if I could pick any one thing this game does wrong, it's absolutely that, okay? And so, anyway, I don't want to get any more distracted on, like, that, because I don't want this to be an actual review of Other M. I actually think I might, sometime in the near future, make, like, an updated 2023 review from my perspective of Metroid Other M. And so, I just wanted to kind of plant this seed in the beginning of this video on why this is a game that I know a lot of people hate, but it is a game that I think is more good than it is bad. I've said it before, I'd rate it like an 8.5 out of 10. I made a list of my favorite, of ranking all of the Metroid games, you know, many years ago, and I ranked it like number 9 out of 13 games that existed at the time. It's not very high on my list, but it's also not at the bottom because I don't think it's the train wreck people claim it to be. And so, like I said, an accidental review of Metroid Other M aside, the point of this conversation is what the gameplay is, the perspective of Samus is in this game, what Nintendo tried to do, and why I think there could be value in Nintendo revisiting the general skeleton of this game. And again, that skeleton being third-person Metroid gameplay. Something else that's widely known about me is that the original Metroid Prime, the 2002 GameCube release, is my #1 favorite video game of all time. So not only is Metroid my favorite franchise, but my favorite game ever created by any company is Metroid Prime, which was a first-person Metroid game. Even though I still prefer the 2D series more than the first-person Prime series, and I like 2D Metroid gameplay more than I like the first-person Metroid gameplay, in a weird twist of fate, I still think that first Metroid Prime game, it's still just my favorite game ever. And I love Metroid Primes 2 and 3 as well. But I think that when we look at where video gaming was back in 2002, when the first-person Metroid game ever released, which was Metroid Prime, and where gaming is today in 2023, and yes, we've had Metroid Other M, we've had Metroid Dread, we've had a Metroid Prime Remaster, we've had those 3DF spin-off, all these different Metroid games that have released between them. When I look at where gaming is today, and I imagine where Nintendo could take Metroid in the future, after Metroid Dread, after the eventual release of Metroid Prime 4, which again I think we can safely assume itself will be first person, I absolutely think there is a wonderful opportunity for Nintendo to revisit third-person gameplay in a third-person 3D Metroid world in a video game and make something really special. The way third-person action games play out nowadays, whether you're looking at a game like Ghost of Tsushima, whether you're looking at a game like, I don't know, the Resident Evil games that are in third person, Gears of War, Legend of Zelda, the Spider-Man games, Elden Ring, I mean, the list could go on and on. Third-person action and adventure games in 2023 in the current era, it's a very different beast than where these kinds of games were back in 2002 when Metroid Prime released. And so if you take, again, we'll go back to the skeleton of Metroid Other M. You're in a third-person environment, you're playing as Samus, you're running in all different directions. Yes, we know the D-pad didn't work that great for that kind of gameplay, but at the end of the day, you still had access to all different directions in a third-person space. It wasn't a 2D game where you're only going left and right. To be able to do that and go into Morph Ball and use your arm cannon and your Morph Ball bombs, and you're jumping up walls, and you're doing all these crazy things. They even built in this insane and very cool cinematic, like, wrestling takedown mechanic that Samus was able to do to some of her enemies. They did some really cool things solely from a gameplay perspective. Again, it wasn't perfect. The Wii Remote first-person thing was definitely awkward. I don't mind it because I found out how to be good with it, but it is awkward. It wasn't really the best idea. And like I said, the lack of analog stick and all these different things, it was not perfect. It was also very simple. You use the one button to shoot, you tap a direction when you're going to get attacked, and she just dodged out of the way. Like, it worked, it was very simple, but it wasn't very deep in terms of combat, but there was something cool there. And again, it's the only opportunity we've ever had to see Samus in this perspective, to play as her in this perspective, and to experience a world crafted by Nintendo in the Metroid universe in this third-person 3D environment. And so, even if you hate Metroid Other M, or if you're like me and you like Metroid Other M, imagine a 2023 or a 2025 or a 2027 release by Nintendo in this era where they give us a Metroid environment and a version of Samus to play with better gameplay, and I'll even admit a better story than what Other M is. They modernized the skeleton of that game, and I'm telling you guys, there's a huge hit on our hands. Naturally, Nintendo would have to be pretty careful with how they crafted the world, the progression through the world, and the story in a third-person 3D Metroid game, again, in the modern era, 2023 and beyond, right? I think that you have to imagine, how does Nintendo take a 3D world, and how do they implement the traditional Metroid backtracking, puzzle-solving element? They'd need to be very careful. Years ago, people wanted to say that Metroid Prime 4 needs to be the Breath of the Wild of the Metroid franchise, where Nintendo crafted this incredible open world for Zelda that was a game changer for that franchise, and people felt like that's what they needed to do with Metroid Prime 4, and I don't agree with that. I'm not going to say that I would be disappointed if I found out that a new Metroid third-person game was just going to be a huge open world where you can do things in any order and just do whatever you want. You land on a planet, here's a huge planet to explore, and just go for it. I wouldn't be disappointed. In fact, I would be excited, like actively excited for it. But I don't really think that is the perfect vision for a third-person Metroid game. I envision something that's actually less Breath of the Wild and more Twilight Princess. To me, the difference is Twilight Princess did have a lot of very large open sections of the Hyrule map, but it had a general story and a progression that happens in a fairly linear fashion. You need to get certain items and certain upgrades and complete certain dungeons in a specific order. Now, you can spend a lot of time between that certain order. You can find side quests, you can find NPCs, you can do certain things, you can go back to different areas that you've previously visited, and just find things you maybe didn't find before. But the general course from beginning to end through Twilight Princess is a straight line, unlike Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, where, to the game's credits, I mean, I love these two games and I love what they did, it is purely open world, just like something like Skyrim. Here's a big world, a bunch of quests, a bunch of people, a bunch of dungeons. Just go find things, complete them in a certain order, and whenever you feel ready, you can go to the ending boss of the game and try to beat that boss. That's fine for those games, and I would be very open to Nintendo trying something like that for a third-person Metroid game, but just speaking for myself as a fan, it's not what I want. I would prefer the Twilight Princess template, and I also think it works better for the Metroid franchise. I think a big, kind of open, gigantic map of a certain planet Samus might be on in a third-person game could work very well if, like the Twilight Princess comparison worked as I mentioned, you had certain areas, certain puzzles, certain enemies to go solve and defeat, certain upgrades scattered throughout the world that the game would organically move you towards, where you get these things, but you could still go back to other areas and unlock new paths forward, right? I mean, even the Metroid Prime games, you know, designed as they were for the mid-2000s, for the GameCube and the Wii hardware, I think that template actually could still work instead of in first person, but in third person, and just to a much, much larger scale. Because in those games, you could go to the different sections, the different maps, the different rooms of the different areas that you're in, and you could find things you couldn't find previously because you maybe got a certain upgrade way later in the game. And the game organically allows you to kind of go wherever you want, but you still have to hit certain points at certain times to progress forward until you eventually reach Metroid Prime, or the Emperor Ing, or the Aurora 313 unit, right? Spoiler alerts for all three of the Metroid Prime games. I truly think a marriage of the Metroid Prime games, of the Twilight Princess kind of structure, and yes, Metroid Other M's third-person action gameplay, I think a combination of those three games is the actual secret success and the secret formula to a third-person, vast, epic, action Metroid Samus adventure. there is a really cool idea there, man. And I don't think it's impossible that Nintendo would do it in the future. More than likely, and as much as it breaks my heart to admit this, more than likely, they would do everything in their power to distance themselves from Metroid Other M because they know that it has a pretty poor reputation amongst a lot of people. And yes, it breaks my heart, man. I like Metroid Other M. I will always like it. I've played it enough times and even recently to know the things that I like about it. Like I said, there's a couple of gameplay things that don't work all that well. There's quite a few story things that very much don't work as well, but there is a lot that I like about the story. There's more to the story that I like than the things that I don't, and same with the gameplay, and I've already said this stuff. So, sadly, I think Nintendo, if they were going to reintroduce a third-person Metroid game that's 3D again, yeah, they're going to try to really drive home the point that it's nothing like this game. And so, if they do that, and if they're successful, I think it would be a huge hit. Not to mention, Nintendo has built up a ton of goodwill with the Metroid fans and the gaming community at large for the Metroid franchise by releasing Metroid Dread and Metroid Prime Remastered, and if Metroid Prime 4 releases and it's as good as we all want it to be, forget about it. Metroid will be in good hands forever. I don't think people will doubt the franchise ever again. Sadly, Other M tarnished the image of Metroid for a lot of folks. I think that's wrong, but that's how some people feel, and that's okay. It's everyone's right to feel that way. Metroid Prime Federation Force also did no favors for the Metroid franchise, even though I also think that game is good in its own bubble. But I think that, you know, Metroid Dread, Prime Remastered, and Prime 4, you're going to have 3 huge successful hits that are going to please the fans. 3 in a row for Metroid. I think it will be the perfect setup for Nintendo to come back and say, here's a new third-person action game. Forget Metroid Other M. Here's the real way we can do it in the modern era, especially if it releases on the Switch 2 or whatever that thing turns out to be. I think it could be really amazing. So as a Metroid super fan, this is what I would like to see for Metroid in third person in the future.